Rachel Smith, former prosecutor on the Idaho case involving convicted murderer Lori Vallow Daybell. That was 2023. It's been a long time, Rachel. Thank you for joining us. You did a lot of hard work. That team did a lot of hard work. But it started with jury selection. What was that like, trying to find a pool of jurors that would be fair and impartial in a county where the crimes did not occur?
Justin, jury selection is hard in any murder case involving children. However, in the Lori Vallow case, there was an added layer of complexity. The media coverage, the public interest in the case, and the extensive search for the children created an environment where jury selection required the court and then the parties to review over 1,800 people. The jurisdictional size of Idaho and Boise in particular greatly increased the number of people who needed to be interviewed. It was one of the most complex voir dires that a prosecutor will ever have to do.
And I remember some of the questions. I mean, the questions had to be very specific, and I know that there were some people who had heard of the case, but maybe they weren't too sure about the information, but they'd seen the headlines about what had happened and how, JJ and Tylee had been found, big headlines, national headlines, but they just didn't know the facts of the case. That's where it gets kind of gray. Take me through that process when you're dealing with someone who just knows a little bit.
Well, when you're dealing with questions involving someone's review of a case, what they call is pretrial publicity questions, the court does an initial screening where they answer questionnaires. And those people who say they know a little bit about a case will then be questioned more extensively. You first ask and find out what their source of information is. And then once you know the source, then you question them specifically about what they saw, whether they formed an opinion as to the person's responsibility or lack thereof, and whether they can put that opinion aside. So you do some foundational questions with jurors to educate them on the importance of fairness, the importance of judging the case based on the facts only heard in the courtroom, and then you evaluate their response. And as a prosecutor, you evaluate their response, but the court is also doing that, as is the defense. And so when their responses are satisfactory, then they move on to the next stage.
And I'm sure you probably still remember some of the faces of that jury that was finally seated and speaking to them face to face and trying to tell this story, and through witness testimony. And all these witnesses come from different backgrounds, different ages, they're different people. Obviously, in the jury pool, you may favor someone that you want in the pool, and someone on the team may say, no, I want this person. And then you have the defense. I'm curious to know if you have insight on just what Lori was wanting. It felt like we didn't hear a lot from her in the first trial, and maybe it's because we're comparing to now where she's representing herself and very vocal.
Right. Well, we could tell who Lori wanted. Lori's very expressive. Her face would light up. She would make eye contact with certain jurors, predominantly men. And when she would make eye contact with them, she would attempt to get them to engage with her. It was pretty obvious what she was attempting to do. Lori has survived a long time throughout her life by manipulating and getting people, but in particular men, to do what she wanted. And so she applied those exact same tactics in jury selection in Boise.
And that is so fascinating that you say that, because we've seen so much evidence through Chandler and Gilbert, Idaho. I mean, you studied it. You were going through all of this discovery with your team. And so you talk about someone who now you can say is manipulative, charming, and has a certain way with people. How obvious was that, and how long did it take you to pick up cues and expressions? I mean, you're studying the person that you're about to try. I mean, what was that like?
Evaluating Lori Vallow Daybell was a long-term project for the entire team. Trying to figure out how to approach her, how to handle it, what if she was available for cross-examination. We spent a lot of time listening to her jail calls. The team, the investigators in particular, listened to scores and scores of calls. And so we walked out of that discovery process, that pretrial preparation process, pretty informed as to what made Lori Vallow tick. So going into trial, we looked for those actions by Lori in the courtroom, and they were very consistent with the actions I think we've seen publicly, even most recently in her interview with Keith Morrison. That will be hard for Lori to turn off in the courtroom. It is very likely that she will behave in the same way.
And she gives it away, right, with body
Yeah.
language and her expression whenever she reacts to something. What do you foresee as challenges for the court in finding a jury within this week? They seem to be confident, and I'm talking about the judge, thinking that opening statements can begin on April 7th, a week from now. Obviously, population is much bigger in this county, but what comes to mind for you?
The challenge for the prosecution and the court in the Lori Vallow case will be to get jurors that haven't formed an opinion. The advantage that the people in Maricopa County have over what Judge Boyce and the prosecution and the defense had in Ada County, Idaho, is they have a much larger population. So and given the increased size that is involved in Maricopa and Phoenix, the court should be able to pull in and use questionnaires to narrow down the number of people who actually have to be questioned. This is a very experienced judge. This is a very experienced prosecutor, and they will know and understand how to get as many people screened quickly and then narrow it down for this case specific, law specific questions. It wouldn't surprise me if they're able to get a jury this week, given the experience. But only time's going to tell us. We'll see what those questionnaires come back with. We'll see what those jurors come back knowing and understanding, and whether they can commit to following the law.
And we know that in these questionnaires, they're straight up listing Lori's name as a defendant and victims in Idaho, just to weed out anyone who knows these names. And she had mentioned, and I don't know if you're surprised, she had mentioned in court that some people may say they don't know a thing about it just so they can get into that pool and be a potential juror on her case. I mean, does she have a point there that somebody would really want to be a part of this and lie on a questionnaire?
Yeah, yes, she does. There will be people who may not lie, but they will downplay significantly. There were times in Ada County when we were reviewing uh, the jurors for Lori's trial there, where we believed the people were downplaying to try to get on the jury. And so one of the tactics that the entire team used, and there was an investigative team that worked extremely hard on this, we pulled the jurors' social media and went back through looking to see whether they had liked or followed anything, whether they had looked at or liked or joined any of the groups involving the search for the children. So there was an extensive amount of behind the scenes work done by the prosecution and in particular, the law enforcement investigation team. Every single juror's we only use the public records, were reviewed and looked at to see if we could find any evidence that they were not being truthful. And fortunately for us, the jurors that were selected, there was zero evidence that they had been anything other than truthful with us.
So that's interesting how social media has become a tool for you guys to really vet people and see who's, talked about this, commented, or shared anything through the media. Yeah, it just makes me wonder, what would it have been like to have this in Fremont County with such a smaller rural community that was so tied and so personally involved and emotionally invested in a case? I know that would be very hard.
Well, candidly, I think with the number of jurors brought in from Ada County, if we had brought in that same number in Fremont, I think we could have done it.
Wow.
Because one of the advantages that Fremont had in terms of vis-a-vis Ada County was they didn't have the level of media market saturation. we reviewed and had experts pull for us media market saturation in both counties. And because of the location and the more rural nature of Fremont, they didn't have actually the level of media market saturation that Ada County had. So I think if we had pulled the same number of people in Fremont, we absolutely could have come up with a fair jury. But the judge, in granting Lori Vallow's motion for a change of venue, shut down any criticism from an appellate court on that issue. So while it was frustrating and extremely expensive for the people of Fremont, long term for the case for appellate purposes, it was the right call.
All right, now I want to talk about her representing herself and being in the shoes of the prosecutor. What sort of landmines are you trying to avoid, and what are the challenges when you're going up against someone who is representing themselves and doesn't have that experience that you do?
A pro se defendant representing themselves is one of the prosecutor's worst nightmares. Normally, when there are two equally positioned adversaries involved in a case, both sides can use their skills, rely on the rules of evidence, and have a fair sort of debate, fair sort of contest um, in the search for the truth. When the pro se litigant is there, the prosecutor really has to take a step back. They have to be extremely patient. They pull their punches. You don't object to every single thing because you can. You watch very closely for the jury to make sure that the jury doesn't think you're picking on the pro se defendant. And so, pro se cases are one of the most challenging for both the court and the prosecutor. You're going to see this week or these coming weeks, a very patient judge, a very patient prosecutor. And it's not because they're rolling over, it's because they're protecting Ms. Vallow's rights and they're protecting the case on appeal.
So we could see this trial go even longer just because you're going through this process with her for the first time and you're making sure that her rights are protected.
Yes, when a pro se defendant is involved, any case I tried is always longer. You have to be careful. You have to make sure that, in some respects, it's frustrating because you almost act like a second defense attorney. You make sure all of your evidence is admissible. You make sure your questions are squeaky clean. You double check and often simplify your case to avoid any issues that could result in an appellate court thinking they're being treated unfairly.
Now I have to ask you this, since you looked at all of this evidence and you guys were able to, you the prosecution were able to bring in witnesses from Chandler PD, Gilbert PD, basically a lot of Arizona evidence came in, so you know these cases very well. Would you say the Charles Vallow case, that murder conspiracy case, is just as strong as what you had in the respective Idaho case?
The Charles Vallow murder case is just as strong as the Idaho cases. We were allowed to use some, but not all, of the Arizona evidence. And if you think about that, that's right and fair. We filed a motion that was heard before the case was heard and before the public could hear it, where the court narrowed and allowed in some things, but not all. That is the way the case was focused because it was focused on JJ, Tylee, and Tammy. That's what that case was about. And so, to the extent, from a legal point of view, Charles's death was relevant. It was part of the conspiracy, part of her plan, part of her need to operate, for money, power, and sex. And the court allowed that in. But Charles's case in Phoenix is going to be about Charles. It's going to be about the conspiracy to kill Charles. And so you will see different evidence. You will see evidence very focused on Arizona, very focused on the planning and the discussion that went back and forth between Lori and Alex. You will probably see way less about Chad. And so this case in Arizona, while having a connection to Idaho, will be very and rightfully focused on what happened to Charles Vallow.
And we're going to learn so much through his his voice in a way. I mean, body camera video, phone calls, text messages. It's clear that this was someone who was trying to remedy a situation with his then wife and get her help, and he was also at the same time being cheated on. So that's definitely going to play to the jury, I think, as someone who is an innocent man, a father, a brother, a husband who was trying to get her help. And how much will we see of her talking about him as a dark spirit and calling him different names and Nick Schneider and this and that and doing energy work on him? How do you explain that to a jury that is not used to this system we were introduced to in the Vallow Daybell world?
Given some of the people on the prosecution's witness list, they're clearly going to get in and touch on some of it. That's a trial strategy call. I don't know how deep they're going to go, but clearly it's going to come up because some of those witnesses on that list, which were not used in Idaho, have direct evidence on those statements on that idea. And so we will see that the coming weeks. We will see that Lori's use of religion was convinced people of the evilness of Charles Vallow. Lori's use of those doctrines and principles were part and parcel of her committing and convincing Alex to act at her behest. So, statements of a co conspirator, those people who are plotting together, come in. So, we will hear Lori's statements to Alex, Alex's statements to Lori, and Lori's statements to Chad, and vice versa, and all of which are part and parcel of that dark spirit.
It's going to get very interesting in the coming weeks. Rachel Smith, thank you so much for your insight and your time. We appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.